This Memorial Day, I had the pleasure to sit down with Christopher O'Connor, who made the trip from Ithaca, New York to attend the annual Cheftique Axe Meetup. A passionate collector, restorer, and user of axes for over 60 years, Chris brings a lifetime of knowledge to the craft. In our interview, he shares stories and insight, especially his deep appreciation for the legacy and craftsmanship of Maine Axes.
Oh, well then, hang on to it, man. Don't trade away something you're in love with.
Right. I have one that looks like this and it has a big A on it. Did you see that?
Yeah, I have.
I heard that was an old snow.
All right, guys, so we are here at Alex from Cheftique's meetup in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, and I had the honor and the privilege of meeting Chris O'Connor from Ithaca, New York. I'm just going to, Chris and I are just going to chat for a little bit. He's been collecting axes for 60 years, as he mentioned to me earlier, and we're just going to have a little bit of a discussion, and he's going to drop some knowledge on us. So, Chris, you've been collecting axes for 60 years. Can you give us a little bit of backstory?
Sure. I was a 10-year-old kid. I used to spend summers way up in Maine, a little tiny place called Bucks Harbor, Maine, that barely exists today. Fellow that was a friend of the family had several hundred acres way back in the woods. He cut his own firewood, he heated with wood. All he had was an axe and a buck saw. The guy never owned a chainsaw. One day he said, "Hey, we're going to Oakland," which was a little town probably 2 hours away. We went there because he had heard that the Spiller Axe Company of Oakland, Maine had gone out of business and that the widow Spiller was selling off her late husband's inventory. So we drove to Oakland. She opened up the doors to her little garage. It was filled floor to rafters with little wooden boxes filled with the most beautiful Spiller axes that you can imagine. All of them wrapped in craft paper, all brand new, some of them probably 20 years old. The axe industry in the 50s and 60s had basically died. And by the time we went there in 65, I think maybe they'd all ended. Emerson and Stevens might have limped along till 65, 66. But the Spiller Axe Company had basically gone out of business probably 10 years before. So I was just a kid. I'd been given $20 to take up to Maine for spending money for the summer. I spent it all, bought two little double bits. Beautiful, beautiful things. I still have them.
Cruisers or
Yep,
full
they're
size?
little 2.5. One was a 2.5, the other 2 3/4 pound double bits. Beautiful, beautiful axes. So we drove back. We stopped in the little hardware store in Machias, which is the only town of any size near where he lived. And this fellow, Bill, showed me how to hang an axe. And I used those two axes all that summer. And for the next few summers, when I would go up there, and I still have them, still use them once in a while. Just absolutely tremendous quality, beautiful, beautiful craftsmanship. And sort of the end of not only the handmade, but the really well-built axes. And that's not to say that only Maine axes were well-made, but they were different than any of the sort of, large companies that made axes. They were probably, there were 14 companies there in little old Oakland, Maine, which was really just a small town. But virtually everybody in that town worked for one of the axe companies at one point or another. And so there were 14 companies, not all at the same time, but one or two might die or get incorporated into another one. But basically, it was the axe industry that kept Oakland alive. So I've got a few examples here. Let me start off with something that's not a Maine axe. This is made by Kelly, a much larger company. This one's got what they call bevels built into it. I believe that was a Kelly patent for a while. And the idea was you could drive it deeper into the wood, and you know, these little indentations here would allow the axe to release from the log a little bit easier. So I mean, these are fine axes. Whether you're talking a Kelly, a Mann, a Warren, any of those were great axes. Certainly, you know, up until about the point that they started using, you know, lousy steel, and you know, they were cheapening out in the 50s. But up until then, these were great axes. But again, my personal opinion, they don't compare in terms of the design and the quality that you find in a Maine axe. This one right here is an Emerson Stevens. This one has got a PT stamped up here. That stood for pine tree. This was a sort of a mid-grade Emerson and Stevens. On the underside, you can see the date that this one was built. This axe was made in 1939. So at the very end of the Depression, just before the start of World War II. And Emerson and Stevens was one of very few companies, well, they're the only company that I'm aware of, where the temperer, the last guy to have his hands on the axe, he would be the one that would dip it in. It was still red hot. He would dip it into the brine mixture, the tempering
To actually
mixture.
quench it.
Yep, to quench it, and basically set the temper. And there were two gentlemen that over the course of the like 80-year history that Emerson and Stevens made axes, that were the temperers. They were generally the older guys. You know, they didn't have it in them to be swinging a hammer so much, but they knew steel. They knew, you know, to tell with their expert eyes. After 40 years each, they could see what needed to be done. One of them was a guy named Pearly Pulsifer. So his axes are stamped with a big capital P, and then his the guy who took over him was a guy named Watson. So there's a big W for the Watson axes. So as far as I know, Emerson and Stevens is the only one where you've got like a thumbprint on each and every axe that was made there, that you could tell, you know, Watson tempered that axe. So just tremendous pride.
Yeah.
And the work that they were doing.
That's unbelievable.
Also, almost all the axes made in Oakland, Maine were handmade. They were made with a softer iron body, and then a temper or a hard piece of English steel that was sandwiched in there, and then they were hammer forged together. So they're really a two-piece axe, as opposed to like this Kelly and virtually any other axe made in the United States after, I would say, like the 1920s. These are one-piece axes. You know, one piece of steel, heat it up. They would use a punch to punch out the eye. Then they would grind them down. It's great. A lot cheaper to manufacture. A lot of consistency there, but there's no real art. Okay, whereas these axes started as a chunk of steel and were formed entirely by human hands, with no micrometers, no measuring instruments, just very experienced craftsmen, you know, saying, okay, that's just the way I want it.
And we were talking a little bit before too about the different manufacturers that were out of Maine at that time. Can you just go into a little bit of some of these companies? And
sure. Well, I mentioned Emerson and Stevens. They were the largest and the last company standing in Oakland. There were 13 other companies in Oakland. Spiller was a very famous one. That's the first two axes that I bought were Spillers. There were a whole bunch of other smaller companies. These were very small scale manufacturing. Little wooden building, you know, a forge, a trip hammer, and you know, 2, 3, maybe 15 people working there. Very small scale. Probably by far the biggest manufacturer in Maine was a company called Snow and Ely. Here's one here. Great axes. This is a wedge pattern snow here. Very simple pattern, sort of a classic Maine wedge designed for chopping through the softwoods that were, that's what they had in Maine. That's what they cut, and they produced gazillions of board feet out of the pines and spruce that they had. Snow annealing was made in the big city of Bangor, and they were different from most of the Oakland makers in that they, I think about 1915, 1920, they stopped doing the two-piece axe and they started making a one-piece axe, just like all the bigger manufacturers. And they were on they probably produced more axes than all the companies in Oakland combined. They were a pretty big outfit. Not nearly as big as say Kelly, but they were a pretty big outfit.
In terms of Maine manufacturers, they were the largest.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Now I brought a couple of.
Well, let's just backtrack here.
Sure.
So what
absolutely.
are we're at Alex at Cheftique's home base here today, and you've brought several hundred examples of beautiful Maine axes. Beautiful. Some of the big three manufacturers, just gorgeous axes that we're gonna obviously show some clips of. One of the things that you were talking about earlier that really intrigued me was the whole idea that the New England, the Maine guys really weren't competing against each other like Plum, Collins, and Kelly were. Can you just kind of elaborate a little bit on what you were talking about before?
I don't know. There's so much to know about axes, and I only know a little bit about like Plum and Kelly and the big boys, down in Pennsylvania and West Virginia. What I do know from research that a friend of mine has done is that they were like the big three in the auto companies.
Yeah, the Ford, Chevy, and the Dodge, right?
Continually squabbling, continually suing each other, trying to undercut each other, not paying their workers anything. They were, they're very, very, very competitive people. Dare I say, not all that nice a group of gentlemen, okay? Entirely different up in Maine, especially in Oakland, where, they were competitive to a degree there, but they cooperated. If somebody lost their say Catco, King Axe and Tool Company, had a fire in their little factory and it burned down, they couldn't make axes, then somebody, Emerson and Stevens or Spiller, would say, well, send your guys over to our place. You can work the second shift there and you can make your axes in our place. And we've got some steel that you can use. So they cooperated. When it came time to order raw materials, because everything got shipped up by train, or down by train, if we're talking the grinding wheels that they got from Prince Edward Island, they would cooperate and put in a large order together so they could save on shipping charges. So instead of this guy ordering 2 grinding wheels and this guy ordering 6 and this guy ordering 8, they'd combine.
We'll order 20.
Yeah, and they'd order 20 all together. Same thing with steel. And if one of them, their orders were slow that time of year or whatever, rather than lay off their help, one of the other companies said, well, send them over to us. We'll give them work. Because it was a small town. Everybody knew each other. And they got along beautifully.
Cool. Well, I'm going to take the camera off the tripod here, and maybe let's just take a closer look at some of these beautiful axes that you have.
Okay, all right. There's the Kelly.
And that's a Kelly Perfect.
I don't know if it's a Perfect.
That's a beveled Kelly.
Yeah.
More modern, like you said, probably
no,
50s.
This is a somebody city, Fall City.
Fall City.
Yep. So that's a lower brand than a
Perfect.
Yeah, lower line.
But that's a more modern manufacturer. You'd say probably what, like 50s, 60s manufacturer?
Yeah, it might have even gone back to the 30s. I'd have to look in the Kelly catalog.
Okay. But that's a one piece, like we were discussing before. That's not a two-piece axe. Now, at any point in Kelly's history, were they making two-piece?
I'm sure they were.
Yeah,
but
it's a lot like the older Charleston, West Virginia ones. Were those all one piece too, or?
I think so.
You think so? Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
like I said, I know something of Maine Axes. Other manufacturers, the major guys, I really know very little.
Okay.
You know, I know what I like, but there's just so much history there.
All right. All right. Well, let's get that hunk of trash out of there.
No, they're good axes. They're good axes.
Let's show what the people want to see here. Let's see the Maine Axes.
All right. So this is a beat up, very beat up Emerson and Stevens. There's the PT that I was talking about. So, you know, I've got some of the old sales flyers for Emerson and Stevens. The last one I've got, I think, is 1941. And I can't overemphasize just how beautiful they were. They sold them with these beautifully designed and lithographed labels that were attached on there. They would go right there. Most of them like 4 or 5 color, just gorgeous artwork.
I agree. I think I've seen a lot of the old catalogs, like all of the artist renditions that you'd see in the old catalogs before photography was, you know, really eminent in the catalogs, and some of the old stamps, or not the stamps, pardon me, the labels that you see online are just beautifully done.
Yeah,
beautifully
I mean,
done.
that's the sort of subset of I collect axe labels as well. Just gorgeous stuff. So I don't know if you can get a close up here on this 39, but
yep.
Okay.
And 39 was the year of manufacturer.
Yep. And then most of the Maine guys would stamp the weight, the designed weight, on the cheek. Here they double stamped it, probably got a little rebound stamping there. So this was a 3 1/4 pound axe. Another difference between the Maine Axes and almost everybody else was Maine did their part pounds in fractions, like 1/4, 1/2, 3/4. Everybody else did like a 3 with a small 2, or a 3 1/2. So 3 2/4
pound, yeah.
Yep. So that's an easy way to tell a Maine axe from almost everybody else.
And usually you see the stampings on the cheeks of the Maine Axes too,
correct.
right? Not on that, like,
although
pole.
Not on sorry, Snow and Ely's. Snow and Ely's, except their early axes, are underneath the pole. So there's a 3 1/2.
Cool. And before anybody asks in the comments, the reason why we have the stickers on the side here is Chris is a major collector, and this is how he kind of catalogs them. So before anybody asks what that is.
So that's kind of a classic Maine wedge. That's got a little bit of dishing on the cheek. I mean, with a real wedge, you could lay a straight edge from the bit all the way back to the pole, and it's an absolutely straight line. But you can see that's pretty close.
Yeah.
So these are great axes. As I said, Snow and Ely are just, you know, way more common than any of the other Oakland axes. Now,
who is the most uncommon?
Oh boy, I really couldn't tell you.
Yeah, just throw a name out there.
There's some that are just extraordinarily rare. I mean, there's some not Oakland manufacturers, but there were literally hundreds of very small manufacturers all throughout Maine, including all along the coast, where during the 1800s they made what are called masting axes, which are very long axes that were used for chopping and shaping the actual wooden mass. That, I mean, we're going back to the pre-revolutionary days.
When ships were made of wood and men were made of iron.
Yep, and when England, would have timber cruisers go out, and they would make or mark the tallest, straightest white pine trees with a king's broad arrow, and it was a criminal offense for anybody to cut one of those trees. That was one of the reasons that America, certainly the New England states, declared their independence. They said, those are our trees, you can't claim them. So here I got a couple Maine double bits. I don't know who made this one. It's very old. You can clearly see, these are called Harmon, Harmon lines. This is the bit steel that's inserted into the softer iron body. So this is actually a 3-piece axe. And yep, you can kind of see it. There's a V there where this is what's called an overcoat or overbit axe head. And this also happens to be what's called a diamond die. And not very many manufacturers made the diamond dies, and they didn't always make diamond dies. I think it was just a, you know, Joe Blow is working today, he feels like making diamond dies, so he did. They're beautiful heads. They're a real pain in the butt to hang. But I mean, something like that, to me anyway, that's a work of art. Now that's probably over 100 years old.
I would agree that it's a work of art.
And you know, I hung it on this nice octagon handle. But I would say that, you know, if you put this in the hands of somebody that knows what he's doing, he could fell a large tree in a very short amount of time.
Okay, so not me then.
Well, I don't know.
Ah, you saw me swinging earlier.
Maybe me 40 years ago. So what do we have here? Okay, we got another Emerson Stevens. This is dated 1935. I don't know if you can see that or not.
Let's get a close up.
Problem is that, you know, some owner at some point had to take the head off the broken handle, and he used a hammer to pound it off. Cardinal sin, but everybody
Yes, sir.
did it. And there you can see the overbit very well. See the darker steel and then the softer, lighter colored iron.
And what's it now? A lot of them were using the overcoat, and then some of them were actually putting the bit in between the two
Yes.
softer pieces.
Yep, there's two different techniques.
The other method of manufacture that I was referencing, that's what would that be called? Like a sandwich method almost, right?
Yeah, that's not the term that they used. I don't remember. Sorry.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Sorry, I wasn't prepared to do this.
No, I know, and I appreciate you, and I think everybody appreciates you, because like you were alluding to before, there's just a lot of misinformation out there.
Yep,
and
absolutely.
You know, even you said earlier, I think you said if I'm hitting on 90% today, that's good.
Yeah.
So I think
know,
everybody appreciates your time.
I'm being as careful as I can, but
Yeah.
I have no doubt but what I'm saying something that isn't 100% accurate. I'm doing this all by memory. So this is another diamond die here. You can see it pretty clearly, I think, with this one.
Yeah, that's...
Now this is a very worn axe. When this was new, the bits were stuck out probably at least another inch, maybe an inch and a half. I've got several new old stock Emerson and Stevens and Spiller double bits. Still got the paper label on them. Never hung, never swung. They're just, you know, really, really works of art.
It's unbelievable. All right, so Chris, good to meet you.
Good to meet you.
Yeah, absolutely a pleasure to meet you. Awesome talking with you today. I appreciate you taking the ride down here.
Absolutely.
I'm sure Alex does too.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for doing
great
this.
Bunch of guys. So.
Yeah, absolutely. We're having a blast today, and
Yeah.
I appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and I hope this was enjoyable. I hope everybody learned something. Awesome, man. Thank
right.
you.
Yep.
That's